afternoon and welcome to this webinar. My name is Dave Dixon. I am coming to you from UConn Center for Land Use Education and Research here at our offices in Haddam, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on managing roadside forests and keeping the power on. We have two great speakers with us today, Jeff Ward and Tom Worthley. And before I turn it over to them, just a couple of quick word about the Center for Land Use Education and Research, or CLEAR. We basically exist to provide education, information, and assistance to folks in communities making land use decisions, helping them balance growth and natural resource protection. And under that sort of lofty mission, there's basically three things that we all work on: land use and climate resilience, water and water quality, and geospatial technology, which sort of is a theme that runs through those other two topics. So that's it for me. I will now turn it over to Jeff and Tom to lead us into today's webinar. Take it away, Tom.
Thanks, Dave. My name's Tom Worthley. I'm Associate Extension Professor for Forest Resources at the University of Connecticut, and my colleague this afternoon is Dr. Jeffrey Ward from the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. He's a forest ecologist and is chief scientist at that institution. We have been working together for a while now to institute some vegetation management research about roadside forests, following a couple of events that you all may remember. There was the October snowstorm in 2011 that occurred on Halloween, and many people lost power as a result of trees. You all perhaps remember Storm Irene and Hurricane Sandy that resulted in similar types of events. And what we found from the power utilities was that 90% of the power outages during these storm events were tree related. And we're here to propose that there are some solutions to this problem beyond simple pruning and trimming, and beyond clearing all the trees away, that we can retain our roadside forests but manage them in a way so that they are storm resistant. And our research goes to address that question. Among the parts of the solution that are necessary is a better understanding of individual tree biomechanics, and we have research underway about that. Appropriate management of the roadside stands, and that's what this presentation is primarily about. How to best assess roadside forest conditions, and a knowledge of the logistics, economics, costs, and benefits of doing such management are all research questions that we plan to address. And then ultimately we'll be embarking on a fairly broad outreach program to communicate and educate the various stakeholders who are interested in this topic. We have a number of sponsors of the research and the demonstration sites that we have underway here. Some of these are collaborators and have offered patches of forest land for us to work on. Some of these folks have offered grant funding and other types of support, financial support. Others have helped with communication and various other aspects of the research. Certainly, this is a short list of all the cooperators and collaborators in this program, and there's a few others that we have as well that are participating or are planning to participate in the future. We call this program, or the education portion of this program, Stormwise, and it's a catchphrase we coined to bring about an understanding that a wise management of this forest resource will help us when storm events take place. And what our goal is to reduce the number of power outages as a result of storms, to reduce the duration of power outages that do occur we don't hope to prevent all power outages due to trees, but we think we can address a fair proportion of them, and reduce the amount of time it takes to get the power back on and to open the roads for your first responders and other emergency vehicles. And we'll open with a discussion about how mature trees and woodlands in Connecticut along our roadsides are pretty much the typical landscape we have. And this is something that everybody is used to seeing. It's part of the characters of the community, but we didn't get to this condition overnight. At one time, going on 200 years ago, would you say, most of the state was cleared for agricultural purposes, pasture land, grazing for animals, farms, and that sort of thing when we were an agrarian society. Around about the mid-1800s, there were quite a number of farms that were abandoned as people moved west to find better markets and better growing conditions for agricultural crops. And the forest tended to grow back in many places. And then about the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were two major pressures on the new forest resource there, one of which was charcoal production. Many, many acres of land were cleared every year for production of charcoal, and there was still a huge demand for fuel wood from trees that grew across the landscape. And as other sources of energy came on board in the early 1900s, the use of fuel wood dropped off and the forest began to grow back. And that's pretty much the forest we have around us today. So in the 1920s, when they started putting up power lines, and this is a little cartoon we have to show, a roadside, a simple power pole, and this brushland condition that would have existed with, a few scattered individual trees in the 1920s, putting power lines on poles seemed like a good idea. 20 years later, the forest is getting a little taller. It's very dense, it's crowded, it's growing in an unmanaged way, it's growing kind of like an unweeded garden. Round about the 1960s, things have grown up so that they're beginning to realize that tree branches and power lines don't necessarily go along with each other, and some pruning might need to take place. And approaching more modern times, the 1980s, we began to have a maturing forest that in many ways is filled with many trees that are approaching the end of their natural lifespan, many trees that have been growing in crowded conditions, and just like any plant in your garden that's growing in crowded conditions, it's not going to be a particularly healthy plant. And trees that are next to the openings, these roadsides and power lines in particular, are growing towards the light. They're arcing out over the power lines and over the roadways, and creating an unbalanced condition, an asymmetrical condition with respect to the crown of the tree. If you fly over the landscape today, that's what you see: trees and forests, and a few houses hidden under the trees, and a few roads hidden under the trees. And while we do have some agriculture and some open land, last estimate I heard was between the urban forest and the rural forest, 75% of the land area of the state of Connecticut is under a tree canopy in one way, shape, or form. Is that about right, Jeff? So. This graphic is taken from the CLEAR maps that were land use maps that were produced recently in the land use change series, and illustrate changes that took place in terms of new development from between 1985 and 2010. This is an area of the state that's southwest of Waterbury, and all of the red in this picture are new developments that were constructed sometime between 1985 and 2010. And while that's a dramatic land use change in many places, what we show this to point out is that all of these changes, or not all of them, but probably 90% of these new developments were built in the woods. These were new roads that were constructed through the forest. Trees were cleared to create the roads and the house lots. And these forests that were disturbed in this way were probably intact, maturing forests with tall trees and that had never been directly exposed to the wind, that had been a continuous canopy until the road and the house lots were put in. So here we have trees now exposed to an edge that had never been exposed to an edge in the past. So to sum up, the forest has grown since the late 1920s, basically in an unmanaged condition in many places. The power infrastructure has also grown since the 1920s and 30s. Most new development does take place in wooded areas these days. And the power distribution infrastructure conceived when trees were younger and smaller has really not adjusted for the changing and aging forest resource. But we're here to make the case that the forest resource can be managed for a species mix, age structure, and density that will be more storm resistant if it's managed more carefully. You want to talk about the task force?
Yeah, one of the interesting things is Governor Malloy, after the two storms, I should say the October snowstorm, Hurricane Irene, and Superstorm Sandy, formed the State Vegetation Management Task Force, which had folks from across the state, university, government, land managers, town officials, and private citizens. And one of the things that came out of that report is we found out and looked at Connecticut leads the nation in the amount of forest cover found in urban areas. 67% of our urban areas are actually underneath trees. The other interesting thing we found is that approximately 36% of Connecticut's roads, about 7,600 miles, cross landscapes that would be considered forest in the traditional rural sense. So we are very much a forested state. It's part of the sense of culture that we have here. And what came out of that were some storm-wise vegetation management research ideas and protocols that were developed simultaneously by the task force and by the folks at UConn. And these were to develop protocols for integrating arboricultural and silvicultural techniques. Now, what does that mean? Arboriculture is just tree care. That's the pruning that we see alongside the roads, which are primarily done by the utility companies. And silviculture is just a fancy word for saying the agriculture of forest. So we want to combine forestry and individual tree care. The other thing we wanted to do is to look at if we were to go in there and treat these forests, and we'll get into more detail on that later. We wanted to monitor how the individual trees responded, how that stand or group of trees responded, and whether or not the work we're doing has a real impact on biodiversity. And actually, Audubon, Connecticut is out there looking at the birds and animals that are using those. What Tom Worthley is working on at UConn specifically is he's looking at developing a marketing strategy for wood products so it doesn't just cost money. And Tom's going to talk more about that later. And I think most importantly for most of us here, we want to see whether or not these new management techniques are going to reduce the amount of disruption to utility lines and roads so we don't lose the power. So public service and emergency vehicles can get through after severe weather. And lastly, we want to promote an understanding and adaptation by yourselves, by the general public, by utilities and foresters, so we can have a new way to manage the foresters so we maintain that character of Connecticut every bit as much as stone walls, forests define our sense of place. But we need everyone to feel comfortable doing this.
So to that end, we've embarked on a fairly thorough and extensive array of activities across the state to put some of these ideas to work and to address some of the research questions that have come about. Around this state, sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service and with assistance from the utilities, we have established 8 different sites under which there is a variety of different roadside forest management activities underway. Different types of silvicultural treatments combined with arboricultural treatments, working with the utility crews that do the trimming, and then working with a woods crew to do the work that's a little bit deeper into the forest. And to build on that whole notion that a little bit deeper into the forest is really what we want to talk about in many ways, and we'll enlarge on that idea in a little bit. We also have some research sites at 3 different locations around the state where we're studying tree biomechanics, and what that refers to is ways different trees of different species and different sizes move in the wind in a stand that's kind of a natural stand that's grown up as we described, and following some sort of silvicultural treatment where there may be fewer trees and the tree has been given room to grow. Does it move any differently? Does it change its movement patterns? And we're tracking that at 3 different sites around the state. We are experimenting with some value recovery projects where roadside trees in the public right-of-way that might have some value on the market could possibly be recovered, bringing some little small amount of income back to the community that perhaps they can put into a tree program moving forward. The vegetation management is based on 4 key principles. First of all, trees with space to grow, just like any other plant, is going to be a healthier tree. Trees that are crowded, trees in stands that are overstocked are going to be stressed. They're going to be competing with each other for space, for nutrients, for moisture. And if we're going to grow trees along the roadside, we need to grow the best, healthiest trees possible, and that means give them space. Second, like any plant that has green leaves that require sunlight for it to do photosynthesis, tree tops and branches will grow towards the light. And so anytime you have a field edge or anytime you have a roadside, you will see the trees angling towards that opening because that's where the light is and that's where the space is. And this in turn does create some trees that are asymmetrical, somewhat unbalanced. Another idea that we are working with is the fact that trees allowed to move in the wind will develop wind firmness. Look at the photograph on the left side of the screen. This is an individual tree standing out in the middle of a field. It's been allowed to grow for, I don't know, the 60 or 80 years that it's been there, fully open, free to grow in all directions. This is not the tree that blows over in the hurricane. It's the tree that's 40 feet into the woods that's been, stressed all its life, that, is the weaker tree when it comes to blowing over in the wind. So one of our ideas in vegetation management is to create space for our better trees. And then finally, when we are growing forests from younger trees or changing the age structure of the stand or planting trees even in more urban settings, we need to be growing the right tree in the right place. Trees that won't get as tall, trees that can grow into a bushier condition instead of a tall straight condition to have along the roadside. And this is one of Jeff's sites. He can describe about this unmanaged 100-foot width of road that we're concerned about.
Yeah, one of the things to think about is when you look at alongside of our roads, there's that first 100-foot strip where utilities companies will come along to clear the branches off so that they aren't touching the trees. But once you get right in back where the utility companies go, there's a no man's zone. It's a zone where the utility companies won't go into because it's too far away for the wires currently, and the landowner, the forester, the logger won't go into because they're concerned that those trees, as Tom described, that are growing into the light, if they cut those trees down, they're going to fall into the power lines or fall across the roads. So there's this wide no man's zone, and that's one of the areas that we wanted to focus on is what can we do to get rid of those trees there that are leaning towards the wire, that, as Dave Goodson said, will eventually, gravity's going to win and they will fall into the wires. And it's not just along rural roads. We can see this alongside of our highways also. So as Thomas said before, he showed the graphic with the trees leaning. I'm going to let him take it away from here.
Well, what's happening right now in our cartoon forest that we grew from scratch there, the utilities have been given permission to prune trees in a utility protection zone, basically in a long oval or an oblong shape, 8 feet from the nearest wire. And that's what they do, because that's what they've been permitted to do. And this certainly does address part of the problem. Any dead branch, any broken branch, any piece of the top of the tree that breaks off and comes straight down that would hit the wires, this sort of pruning does address that kind of issue. What it doesn't address is, what about the weak tree, the poor tree, the defective tree that's 30, 40 feet, 50 feet back, but is 80 feet tall and could still tip over and impact the wires in the road. So one of the things that we're suggesting is, instead of just pruning, perhaps some of these weaker trees right along the edge should be removed completely, and perhaps this is taking place in some places where those trees are within the utility protection zone, but along some of the wooded roadsides, we suggest that there are other things that we might grow in those places instead of, struggling trees that are arcing towards the light. Jeff has some graphics that he'll explain the desired condition, if you will, under some circumstances that we have in mind.
Yeah, just think about, look at the trees on the left and how many of our roads have trees which just look like tall sticks with little cotton balls up on top. Those trees are not wind firm. They sort of look like a dense pine plantation. Those trees are very, very susceptible to wind throw. But if we look over on the right, like where we saw the picture earlier, if we saw those trees growing in open field, those open grown trees, they don't get as tall, they tend to get wider, and they're much, much more wind firm. And by having those open grown trees, it also gives us the opportunity to be growing shorter trees and shrubs which benefit wildlife. It allows us to maintain the aesthetic appeal of those areas. Another way, if there's a couple of engineers in the group to take a look at, is this is just a graphic representation where the small circles up on the top one show where you've got very dense crowded forest. Our idea is to eventually develop a forest where we have those large picturesque trees. And one thing to think about when we're thinking on aesthetics is, do you take a picture of those tall spindly trees, or do you take a picture of one of those gnarly old trees? But those gnarly old trees with the thick trunks and the thick branches, those are the trees which are more wind firm, as you can see in the bottom. And again, it's just explaining that there's different zones, and one of the things we want to manage is consider how far away we are away from the poles. In that first 33 feet away from the poles, especially where we're going through woods, that's really not the place where you want to have a pine tree or a poplar or really any tall tree, because those trees are going to have branches which are directly interfering with the power lines. But it's a great place to grow shorter trees, to grow dogwoods, to grow shrubs like witch hazels, to grow small ornamental cherries if you happen to be in a more developed area. As you go further and further away from the forest, you can start having taller and taller trees. And eventually, what you'd like to do if you start up on top, and that's a pretty typical way that a lot of our roadside forests work. And I do want to give credit to Kimberly Barbero, I'm going to mispronounce her name, who came up with these graphics. But look at the top one. Is that not typical of many of the roads that you have in your communities? Well, the idea is that by gradually clearing out those tall trees that are interfering with the wires, we can go more towards an amphitheater effect, where we have a very nice roadside forest with a diversity of shrubs and vegetation, but none of them really getting tall enough to interfere with the wires, to interfere with the roads when we do have a storm.
And if you don't mind going back for a second, Jeff, if you look at that graphic carefully, and Kimberly did a great job of illustrating this, there's there's growing stock in place already in the existing forest in many places that we can work with to allow it to give it the space to grow, to occupy those areas that are closest to the power lines. Give the competitive advantage to the dogwood tree, to the cedar tree, to the to the ironwood tree, something that won't get very tall, and then give a competitive advantage further back to this big bushy tree that will be a spectacular aesthetic tree to look at, but far enough away and big and bushy enough so that it would be relatively wind firm.
The one other thing on this, I'm glad Tom stopped us here, is that by giving those trees that we select, by thinning around them and give them room to grow, we're also giving their root system room to grow. And some we don't often think about. If those trees have a bigger root system, they're going to be better anchored to be able to hold themselves in place during a windstorm.
So let's go back to our illustrated forest that we grew from scratch, and this group of not very robust trees that we removed at, right along the roadside, leaving some, having selected some very promising, healthy trees, even though they're tall trees, but trees that we think have good chance to develop some wind firmness and some crown symmetry over time. This is just one approach that one might take in our hypothetical forest, but we're also looking a little deeper into the woods and identifying those trees we consider to be defective or stressed or at the end of their natural lifespan, and removing those with the idea of providing some space on the other side of the trees we have along our roadside to give them that space in which to expand. And they would expand and occupy that space, and then if there's sufficient sunlight brought to the ground, we would begin to also stimulate some seedlings, some new growth, some trees that would be a future for us there as well. With the understanding that these trees we retain right now, have a lifespan as well. Once again, the branches will develop towards the light and space. And these trees given space to grow will be healthier and more robust trees. And the trees with freedom to move in the wind will develop that wind firmness. Looking from the top, there's our space we've created for the crowns. The crowns would expand into that opening, and we'd have our roadside forest providing all the benefits that the roadside forest does, but with less threat to the power infrastructure and the roadway. Once again, I want to reiterate, we don't hope to solve the problem 100%, but in a stretch of roadway, if I can have one tree that falls down and needs to be cleared away instead of 10 trees that fall down, that would be a huge improvement. So Jeff, let's start to explain some of the procedures that we've used to set up the research and some of the things that we're trying to accomplish in different forest conditions.
One of the big things what we want to do when we set these demonstration forests up is we want to, within a couple of years, we should have a pretty good handle on whether or not the trees in the forest are responding the way they think we would, so that we can take you out and with confidence before you start saying, completely changing the way we're managing our roadside forest, this is going to work. This isn't just a bunch of people sitting in an ivory tower saying how to do it. And between Tom and I think we have over 50 years, probably getting close to 60 years of practical experience. So we're pretty confident, but we know that.
Wait a minute, I would like all these people to think that we're just young, brown-haired guys, that are robust and strong and, ready to go out there and
we're both gray and one of us is bald. So anyways, within all these areas, we've actually identified all the trees, which were at least 4 inches in diameter, and have mapped them in and have selected which trees we're going to leave. We've not only mapped these trees in, we've measured how tall they are, what sort of defects they are without to get into all the details. What's their taper? In other words, are they thick, robust trees or aren't they thick, robust trees? And this actually, the picture you see there, the main picture, shows an area over Monroe, one of our sites, and you can see what it looks like beforehand. And the tree which says 369, it's got the white band on it, those two. Those are some yellow birches, and these are actually a little bit away from the road. but they have good form and they should hold up in a windstorm. So those we put a white band on to say we're going to save. And the trees that have a blue slash, we're going to cut off. Again, as Tom said, the idea is to give these trees room for their crowns to develop. We're trying to select species which are going to get very robust. Not trees that foresters would typically necessarily pick, but things like American beech or sugar maple or even younger oaks that can grow wide rather than tall.
The key phrase that Jeff mentioned there was that we selected the trees that we want to keep first. We identified the trees we thought had the most promise of developing in the way we anticipate they would, and that look like the healthiest trees, that look like the most well-balanced trees that would occupy that forest in the future.
Yeah, one of the key things here too, this is just showing some more shots more we're measuring in trees, is to make sure that we're getting all those trees which are leaning towards the road. Because those trees that are leaning towards the road are trees that are eventually going to fall in the road. And this is where United Illuminating and Eversource have been great partners, because they're willing to actually invest in removing those trees proactively, not waiting until a storm comes and tears out power lines and blocks highways, but removing these trees and then leaving the wood on site for the landowner to use.
This is a site in Coventry. Once again, you'll notice the trees have all been numbered, measured, located, mapped on the ground, so we know the precise location of every trunk of every tree, over 4 inches in diameter, its species, its height, its size. We have a lot of information about a lot of trees out there, and trees that have been identified to retain on the site as keeper trees, as trees to grow, have been in this case outlined in a yellow stripe, and then other trees marked for removal have been marked in blue. And we did all this marking and selection in advance of having any kind of work begin as far as cutting the trees is concerned. And notice in the caption we talk about a specific site objective. That means what's the desired condition for that particular site, and develop the prescription around that. And a lot of these sites are going to be different. There's no one cookbook recipe for all our roadside forests. The conditions vary dramatically, and so each site needs to be taken on its own merit.
Yeah, one of the reasons why we went to all this extent to actually number the trees and map them in is we're sure we have a pretty good idea on which trees are actually going to be able to respond well, which trees are going to be those that can survive the storm and like this treatment. But we'd like to be able to take you out there and demonstrate to you, saying, these are the trees we selected, and you can see how they've done well after a storm. And actually adjacent to all these areas, we have other areas pretty much identical where we're not treating the trees. So you'll be able to go out there and actually see that indeed you can select trees which are going to be able to respond well and become storm resistant.
Hold it there real quick. One other thing to point out here, there's in the inset photograph, the one that's on the right, the smaller photograph, you'll see a larger tree with a yellow stripe. It's out there near the stone wall. The road is on the other side of the stone wall there, and this tree has been marked for retention. This tree was identified as being straight, healthy, balanced. We expect that tree to be able to remain there and develop some wind firmness over time. But what I'm really interested on this site is this growth of pine trees that are smaller, younger trees that are in the understory, the shorter trees. That's the future forest right there. And someday, 20, 30 years from now, when this other larger oak tree is removed, the pine trees will take its place, and they can actually be managed from the ground and given plenty of space and turned into one of these big bushy pine trees that the timber guys aren't really interested in because it's not good logs, but would make a great roadside tree, a great roadside pine tree. The work that has to be done requires some skill, requires some specialized equipment in order to actually get the work accomplished. As Jeff mentioned, we've had great cooperation support for the research and the demonstration sites from the power utilities and the utility crews. They have helped us do the work planning, had crews that had to do the high work. This tree that you see on the right-hand side that's mostly rotten and ready to fall in the road, well, that's going to be a hard tree to control, so it needs to be taken down from the top. You need an arborist with a bucket truck and a skilled chainsaw operator to be able to remove that tree and get it on the ground safely. That's the key primary job of the roadside tree crews. And the tree really has no commercial value at all, so we're not worried about saving any material from that tree. But back in the woods a little way, as represented by this photograph in the lower left corner, a regular woods crew chainsaw operator can drop that tree from the ground and using directional felling techniques get it on the ground safely in a direction that we would like it to fall. So this is just a picture of one of our sites where we had the arborist crew, we had a woods crew in place, we had some value recovery equipment on site to do to mill some boards and railroad ties and cut up some firewood just to try out all these things as we were working along and keep track of the various products and volumes that we were able to produce, what their value was versus the expense associated with getting the work done. The typical procedure would be that a forester and an arborist would go along the roadside and on the immediate roadside trees designate which trees would be retained, which trees would be trimmed, and which trees would be removed along the roadside. And then the forester would go in the woods, identify the most promising trees to keep on the site, and from that process then have the trees that probably should be removed in that 100-foot strip, have them be revealed. The arborist troop came along, topped the roadside trees that were selected for removal, but they left the trunks standing. This was an effort on our part at this site to do value recovery along most public roadsides where trees are dropped in power line maintenance. There's a group of very energetic folks out there who come along and cut up everything and haul it away for firewood, and we were hoping to recover something more valuable from firewood. So that the tops and branches were left there for the firewood users, but we left the trunks standing. And I also wanted to prove that we could get these trunks on the ground without a whole lot of extra effort. Going back.
One of the interesting things too is working with utility companies is they have a great expense when they have to remove trees all the way down to the ground. And working with them and with foresters, if the tree height is left is brought down short enough so it won't impact the wires when it's cut down, and as Tom said, with directional felling, we can leave them there until there's a job in back and they can actually be harvested, and the material can be used in trimmed and saw logs and help recover some income for the landowner.
We have a question in removing that has come in, and the question has to do with, in removing trees, do you cut them down directly to the ground, or do you leave short stumps? And you'll see that in just a minute. Okay, see the answer to that question in just a minute here. Here's Meg. She's one of our UConn Forest crew members who was working the site this summer. She's working on a red pine tree that was all of 120 feet tall, was infected with southern pine beetle. The state forester asked us to go ahead and remove all the red pine that was infected with southern pine beetle because it was going to die anyway. And being within 40 feet of the roadside, this 120-foot tall tree had a very good chance of falling into the road and impacting the power line, so it was designated for removal. She makes an opening cut that, in the direction that the tree is going to fall. She bores through the tree with her chainsaw, leaving a little wood uncut on the backside, sets wedges to help direct the tree to where it's going to drop, and then releases, cuts the last bit of wood and releases it to drop. And then we're using some small scale equipment for removing the wood in this site because it's a very small area, an acre and a half. Very heavy, large scale logging equipment would be too expensive and too costly to operate in a small site like this. So we were operating seeing how we would do with some small scale equipment to move the wood out. Here's a roadside tree in the left-hand photo that has been topped, standing right alongside the road. It's a birch tree, has some value to it. It's a pretty good birch saw log, and so we left it standing with the idea that we would cut it later and recover the log with the idea that that value could go back to the public entity that owns the tree. So we've made an opening cut in the direction we want the tree to fall, basically parallel to the road, and directed that so that it's angled a little bit interiorly to account for the lean of the tree, bored through the tree with the tip of the chainsaw. All this is done with some precision in terms of the degrees of opening we create and how wide of a hinge we want to create and how thick of a hinge we want to create to direct the fall of the tree, and leaving some wood on the back side so we can set a wedge to make sure the tree doesn't fall in the wrong direction and then to help us tip it over, and then cut this last little bit of wood that's been left on the backside. And as you can see in the right-hand photo, that trunk was dropped directly parallel to the road. We only had to stop traffic for about a minute and a half to get that last little bit. All the work was done, in preparing this tree for falling, without worrying about it tipping over too soon. And we only had to stop the traffic for a couple of minutes to do that final cut and get that tree on the ground safely. Once again, recovering some wood products. This is some of the red pine from that site, and it was processed on a portable sawmill into 2x material. We also processed some oak logs for the state to use for picnic tables with the State Park Division, and sold the dimension lumber made from the pine to a local customer who was using it for an outbuilding. So I haven't quite summed up all the costs yet, but I like to think we at least broke even on the value compared to what it costs us to do this project.
And I think an important thing to realize about that, what Tom is working on is something you can probably use on a lot of properties, just to be able to break even, to be not spending money when you're doing the roadside forest management, would be a huge change where, like I said, it doesn't cost you anything in the long run. You can get this work done without blowing through your budget.
Especially in the small areas. When you think of a 400-foot stretch of road that's 100 feet deep, we're only talking about an acre of land. And so big heavy-duty equipment, it may not be appropriate in short, narrow strips like that. In some places, we've been able to combine our stormwise management with, larger acreages adjacent where, it's been time to work with a traditional timber sale process. But in the sites where there isn't a timber sale underway, and the management can still get done, because the utility is going to prune the trees anyway, so they may as well work with us to designate the trees that need to be removed, and then an educated forestry professional can work through that 100-foot zone to identify the best trees to keep, and then a crew can be trained to do the work adjacent to the road using the techniques that we have been practicing here. So,
one of the things to think about is, I imagine many of you out there have been called out in the middle of the night or in the middle of a weekend because there's a storm on a road maybe similar to this where trees have fallen down across the wires, and it's your responsibility to go out there and try to coordinate with utility companies, with your Public Works Department with the folks who are cutting up the trees to take care of it. Well, the idea is we go through and we remove those trees, those hazard trees, those risk trees are going to fall on the wire. And we're left with a forest where it's still very aesthetic. And this is, believe it or not, is 2 months after cutting. We're left with an aesthetic looking forest, but now there's much, much reduced risk of those trees going down across the wires. That's going to mean less getting up in the middle of the night, less leaving your family during the weekends when you have an activity plan.
A couple of shots of before and after of the same site. This was on state land, a foggy fall, early winter day prior to treatment, and the following spring after treatment when things began to green up. And this was going on 2 years now, so there's been 2 years worth of growth on that stand.
And one thing you might not appreciate, you just see, wow, there's power line through the woods. Who really cares about that? Well, if you live in Lebanon, if you live in Colchester, I'm going to blank out, there's one other town, parts of Haddam. That's your power is on those 3 lines right there. When those wires go down from a storm, even though it's going through a road on a state forest, you lose power.
This is, Jeff alludes to the fact that on 7,600 miles of road, we can't hope to necessarily program this sort of management on all the miles all at once, but one of our areas of research is to use some remote sensing technology to identify areas of highest priority, and that's an effort that's being worked on as we speak. But if we can put the management in place in the highest priority areas to minimize the number of outages, that will be a positive that would be a positive outcome. We do have another question. What is the typical foot or length or dBH to consider worthy of use without being species specific? Most of the hardwood markets here will use, for saw logs, will use a tree as small as 10 inches diameter at the small end of the log. Okay. Now that small log needs to be relatively straight, relatively free of defects. Larger logs are more valuable, and also many of the markets are quite specific about the lengths of logs they want. So we can't just cut any old length and send it to the sawmill and expect them to make something out of it. It needs to be exactly the right length for whatever product it is that they're producing because of the nature of their equipment. I hope that answers your question. In softwoods, it's a little different.
But generally speaking, they're going to want at least an 8.5 foot or a 10 foot long log. And as Tom said, you look at the diameter at the small end.
There is a market in Connecticut that does use smaller wood, lower grade wood for manufacturing into chips. That wood is picked up in long length and loaded on trucks and sent through a chipper, but they pay by the ton as opposed to by the board foot. This site that you're looking at here, this is a quick summary of some of the products and some of the values we were able to obtain from an acre of treatment at the UConn site. As it was, our cost was slightly over what we recovered in terms of log values and wood values, and this was done with a small scale crew. Somebody whose business this was to really do this professionally could probably do a little bit better job of value recovery. A little more close-up view of the same site, and the reason I include this this photograph is to point out on the left-hand side of the power line is where the treatment took place. We have what looks from this angle like a fully stocked stand of straight, tall hardwood trees. On the other side, on the right-hand side of the power line, is the untreated side, and you'll see we still have that tunnel effect of branches hanging over the power line. So this is the side that is untreated for comparison. And aesthetically speaking, it's not all that different. It's not all that objectionable, if you will, following the initial disturbance. And this site on the left-hand side will be recovering and growing a lot of small trees in the shade of these other trees. It's pretty well stocked with shade-tolerant hardwoods to develop into the future forest. Another angle of the trees that were left behind, identified because we felt they had symmetry or the potential to develop symmetry. Each one of these crowns has been given some space to be able to move in the wind. This is also one of our sites that's wired for keeping track of tree movement, to monitor tree movement in the wind, and lots of data has been collected at this site in how the trees have moved during wind events, before treatment and after treatment, and that'll be a topic for another seminar a different day. We're doing our best to educate people as we go along. There's some signage generally up at most of the sites where we're doing some work, and this is to try to explain what's happening at these sites.
One of the things you might be concerned about if you start doing a management program like this on your land is, what's the public going to come up and say to you? And at least for us, it's been a very eye-opening experience. I would say roughly a third of the people come up and say, geez, why are you cutting down every tree so I never lose power? A third of the people come up complaining, why the heck are you cutting down any trees at all? I don't care if we lose power. I have a generator and I love the way it looks. And a third of the people come up going, hey, can I have that firewood? So basically speaking, you're going to have a wash. And every time we're working there, wherever we're working, we have at least half a dozen people, even on the side of the highway, who will stop and come out in the woods and ask us what's going on.
Yeah, we've had that experience too on the sites where the UConn crew has worked. We actually had one fellow stop and say, boy, I wish I could come out here and work with you. I used to do this kind of work.
Yeah.
You know, he's doing something else these days. We've been trying to come up with ways to educate the tree crews about looking at trees as a collection of potential products, as well as getting it safely on the ground. Can we develop a spec sheet that they might use for the purpose that's instructional in ways? Can logs that come from trees that are in the public right-of-way be recovered and sold on the market for recovery by the towns? And one of the surprising things for me was not that whether the town was interested in participating, but how hard it was to find a place to store the logs temporarily. You know, it wasn't an easy task. We have a question. Is Eversource on board with these management techniques? To be honest, yes. As long as it doesn't cost them a whole lot more than it's costing them right now. They've been cooperating all along the way. They have sponsored some of this research. They're very interested in outcomes that they can put to work right away. And so there's still a lot of questions to answer, but the short answer to your question is yes, they are on board with this. We have some outreach goals to in our educational program moving forward. We want to gain public and professional acceptance of this roadside forest management. We need to get out of the idea that it's a bad idea to disturb any trees along the roadside. What we want to do is find our best trees and grow them well. We need to increase public understanding of what the benefits of all of this might be. And when we talk about economic benefits, I'm not talking about the value of the trees or the value of the logs. I'm talking about what the economic cost is to having extended power outages and what the cleanup costs are following a severe storm. That runs into the millions and millions of dollars. And if we can cut that dramatically, we'll be way ahead. We need to be able to establish cooperation amongst a variety of stakeholders, whether it's public officials, the utility workers, people who own the property, and to train the labor force to do this work, and develop a workforce that can adopt this particular task moving forward. So we have an educational challenge set for us here. We do have communities of place that we'll need to address in one way. These would be the local the towns and officials, the tree committees, the tree wardens, the emergency management directors, folks like that who will be very interested in this sort of management. As I mentioned, the communities of practice include the foresters, the arborists, the people who do harvesting, and the urban foresters. Can we develop a small-scale wood utilization community that addresses local wood markets? That's another area that we're investigating. We have communities of interest, people who are interested in anything that has to do with trees and anything that has to do with birds and wildlife and growing things, and attracting the interest and support of organizations and other stakeholders will be to our benefit moving forward as they come to understand what it is we're trying to accomplish. We do have a website. There's a website revision underway. We hope to have it in place by the end of the calendar year, so it'll be fresh and more newsworthy than it currently is. And if you want to get in touch with us, this is contact information. You can write down or retrieve later in the archives. And with the last 2 minutes, we'll ask Jeff to talk about some of the photos he has on this last slide in terms of the different conditions that we find.
Well, I think I'm just going to go through this really quick, and I'll go back to our contact numbers. But think about that. These practices eventually could be applied from wires running through roads to just gravel roads or dirt roads. They could be used on our city streets, or our town roads, I should say. They could be used along highways, and indeed we're actually working with DOT on looking at a different way of managing the roadside forests, which I know has raised some people's eyebrows in what they're doing. And they're willing to take a look at how can we manage these forests to maintain the aesthetic quality of them. So with that, let me go back to our contact. And next question we have, have you been able to estimate the environmental value of recovering wood for the market versus allowing the material to immediately enter the waste stream? I'll let Tom address the cost part on here. Actually, I'm not quite sure what you mean by waste stream there. Waste stream would cost money.
Yeah. Well, the waste, what I'm thinking you mean by waste stream is when trees are removed and chipped up and loaded on a truck and hauled and dumped somewhere. That's, to me, a waste stream, and it's kind of a waste of natural resources. There's environmental value of recovering wood for the market, whether it's as fuel wood or as hard products. Any quality lumber products that are produced from trees and managed anywhere, but in this case in particular, generally get made into some sort of product that has longevity, flooring, furniture, things that are going to be around long enough to grow another tree in their place. And that sequesters a large portion of the carbon for a longer period of time. And even there's some argument about whether burning wood or burning chips is carbon neutral or not. But for the most part, we tend to think that it probably is carbon neutral, and you need to factor in the energy it costs to produce that. But anything that, in my mind, that slows down the use of fossil fuels is a worthy alternative to consider. I hope that answers your question. And with that, we'll wrap up the webinar. Feel free to contact us by email or by phone. We work out in the woods an awful lot, so if we don't respond to your phone call right away, please forgive us. I'm better at responding to email than I am with phone calls, but feel free to contact us anytime.
Yeah, I really appreciate everyone sticking with us throughout this seminar. Thanks a lot, and take care.